When you're talking about adding the layers of oil paint, once it's been tipped up vertically, where is it? Is it just at the level of feeling at which you feel like you've added enough paint that it both becomes a unified surface and you experience it palpably as joined by the paint, but also there's the integrity and recognition of the many parts underneath that are disparate? Like how do you balance those two things vis-a the paint?
I think what you described goes on. I think I do that, but it's not particularly conscious. I pretty much just try to work intuitively, or we would say extemporaneously, and not think too much. And I usually do it at the end of the day before I leave the studio. But certainly when I think a work is sort of getting close to maybe what might be finished, or it's becoming something, it's finding itself. That's when I sit back and with a critical eye, in a sense, and look at what's really going on here? And what does that mean? Or what could it mean? Or do I want to emphasize this? Or do I not like that? Or, that's where I sit there and make those decisions. I don't make them while I'm working. But in that process of layering, and people ask me, well, how many layers of paint? I don't know. For the most part, though, I can tell you, I tend to, and again, there's no reason for this. It's just what I do. Is I tend to cover the whole canvas with a layer of paint. I don't tend to build up areas, because just as I've built up areas with burlap, one could make thicker and thinner layers of paint. I don't tend to do that unless it's about glopping it around push pins or staples or grommets. I don't tend to work in an area except in those cases. So it tends to be pretty uniform, one color over the whole canvas. But like I said, maybe not in the beginning, maybe not even later on, because I'm using up other paint. Mm-hmm. But as I move along, I begin to choose what those colors are that I am painting with a really cheap paintbrush, by the way, house paintbrush, across the whole painting. It's usually one color or a variation of that color. And it's because, again, it's working in that state of peripheral control, because I know from having made a lot of paintings, I kind of know right now, I've been making chenille paintings for 4 years or something, that I know certain colors that I want to bleed through from underneath. So the top layers, not in any particular order, and I can go in and paint splotches of things around if I want to. I can do whatever I want. There's no rules there, but I tend to work with different sort of dark browns or umbers, burnt siennas, gold ochres, yellow ochres, and different reds, red ochres, to different kinds of reds. What I think are going to be the top underlying layers of paint. So it's what I think based on what my body knows from before. But that's always risky, because so often I'm wrong, and so often it takes many more layers. And sometimes I just have to go back. And even though the top layer, I like the color, the surface, the physical presence might not really be there yet. And if that's true, when I sit back with that critical eye and I go like, girlfriend, you've got the color, it's working, but the paint itself isn't speaking, doesn't have the presence, I don't care how much it costs, you have to go back and repaint those last 3 layers of paint. Even if it's cadmium red and very expensive, you have to do that. So that's it. But there's a point where I kind of know I'm honing in. I'm getting there. I'm getting there in terms of surface, color, kind of coming together. And then what I've been using in the last year or two, not entirely, but is a very warm off-white color, which I like. And then I like the way that the dark umbers and ochres or reds show through in seams and cracks and crevices in the surface, in the warm white surface, and around, there's splits in the seams and so forth. So they immediately, you get color that asserts itself from underneath. And either through the grommet holes or at the seams. And sometimes it just blends into that warm white paint on the surface, kind of bleeding into it, changing the color. Sometimes a lot, sometimes more subtly. And so when I began to work this way with the paint, it was then after making 1 or 2 of these paintings that I began to think that the patterns of the raised grommets blopped with paint reminded me of the patterns on chenille bedspreads. And that's when I began to think of them then more conceptually. But before I talk more about that, I want to go back a little, if you don't mind, to just say that when I started working with the burlap versus other pieces of canvas or other fabrics, and affixing it archivally to the surfaces of the gessoed canvases, and then I had them all leaning up. I had I think 4 of them going, leaning around the studio. And I always lean things around the studio, by the way, and I also move canvases around and materials around in relationship to the canvases vertically, because I'm looking for what I call uneasy juxtapositions of things. Okay, so it's not about necessarily joining them. It could be, but I'm really always looking for what I call. I work through juxtaposition more than integration, and I'm interested in what's the tension there. Are they simpatico? Is there an edge? What is it? So I do that on a larger thing, moving mixed, materials, including canvases around. And then I do that within a canvas thing. Okay, now I've got 4 canvases. They've got they're covered with burlap. Well, the burlap was so beautiful. Those paintings, those canvases sat there in my studio. I don't know, I want to say close to a year, but maybe it really wasn't that long. I didn't know what to do with them because I was so enamored with the burlap itself. And that sometimes happens for me. It can happen with the material, or if there's a kind of a sign or something like that, where I have to kind of sit with it, come to terms with it, to kind of make it my own. And I went through a very long process before. I didn't just put paint on them automatically, like I thought I was going to, like I had done with other fabrics. Of course, there was Alberto Burri sitting over here, and whose works I love, but of course did not want to redo. He does them quite well, or did them quite well. There was also the sacks themselves. They're coffee sacks. They have printing. They've come from different countries. I had to realize these paintings were not going to be about the coffee industry or markings, or about coffee in South America and rainforests. It wasn't about the political, it wasn't about working with the politics of the writing on the coffee sacks. And I had to get to slowly the fact that I was using them materially. It was an ubiquitous material, a common material that I was responding to in the way you might pick up a beautiful piece of patinated metal or a beautiful stone or a rock with lichen on it. It was that was my initial gesture of being drawn to it, was for its physical properties. And I had to go through these layers of other things, like the politics of where the coffee sacks came from, because those are kinds of questions I always ask, and I would ask about anybody else's work. And I had to realize, no, Harmony, that's really not what these are about. This is not what you're doing. So then that allowed me, it freed me up to just cover over them. It's just covered over, a common material. Likewise, the holes. Other artists have used holes in their canvases. How do my holes function? Then I just let my painting speak to me. What was going on here with the layers of burlap and the textures and the edges and the fraying threads and so forth, and the holes that opened up the surface but also protruded out into your space? What's going on here? Once I got to that point, I was on a roll. I got it. But it wasn't easy getting there. And then, like I said, the paintings themselves, also the surface gets built up very slowly. So now to go back to the idea of chenille, again, it's not anything I researched. I mean, I looked up a little bit later, but not ahead of time. I didn't start out to make paintings that look like chenille bedspreads or reference them. I was looking at the paintings that I was doing, which were near monochrome, a near monochrome warm white color, and had these protrusions that reminded me of the tufted threads, the patterns of tufts on chenille bedspreads, and what was going on. And so I liked that reference. I grew up with those bedspreads. It's a warm, cozy feeling. We kind of know them. They're not always white. Chenille's not always white, but a lot of the bedspreads were white. And then I noticed, though, there was an edge to the paintings as well. So it wasn't the paintings, despite the reference to warm, cozy, soft bedspreads, aren't warm and cozy, I don't think. And so there's this edge, and the edge comes from these protrusions and these splits and these colors asserting themselves. So that's the territory I tend to work in.
On this point about the chenille paintings and your strategy of juxtaposition, to my experience of the burlap is as a material that really performs its wovenness. It's coarsely woven, and even under those dense layers, it really makes you aware of its condition as a woven textile. And it's also material that I think of as very rough and not often coming into proximity of the body of a body. It's like you don't have clothes made out of burlap. You don't have blankets made out of burlap. However, when you introduced this language to those paintings made out of burlap as the chenille paintings, you then introduce this juxtaposition with a kind of fabric which is very soft and that you always think of in proximity to the body. And so I'm wondering how you think of the language itself as a material that you are using in these very formal material paintings to cultivate those kinds of juxtapositions you talked about.
I like that you made that observation a lot, because I always thought of the burlap is crude, it's rough. I almost think of it as like a rough hair shirt or something almost with a sense of martyrdom about it or something like that. So that's what's kind of this tension, I think, of interest about these paintings. They're chenille or they look warm and cozy, but it's really pretty rough and coarse. And I like that. And it makes me think of, I think it was Robert Storr, but I'm not sure, somebody who used the term painting roughed up. And I like that term a lot. Wherever I came across it, I'm not sure, it may not have been him, but wherever I came across it, I went like, oh yeah, that's what I do. I went like, that's what I do, you know, and it's there. It's definitely there. So there's this funny thing, and you kind of also suggested it before, Jarrett, of as I layer the paint sutures the pieces together. So paint, while we've got rips and tears and, you know, things protruding or who knows what else, fraying, coming apart, they're held together. They're sutured together by the poultice of the paint. And the painting skin holds the paintings together. And we get to see the parts, which you pointed out. Things are not covered over to the extent that you don't know what's there. You can see the process of maker and making in these paintings. It's there, and yet it's held together with paint. And for me, this was really an important thing, because to earlier paintings, when I started doing the near monochromes, and I was very focused on grommeted straps being wrapped around the paintings. The surfaces were still collage, similar to the same way of the chenilles, but the fabric was not as textured. There was no burlap. It was other fabrics. Okay, on these near monochrome paintings, then actually they were on canvas, which came from my Aikido dojo, which is another conversation, but the straps then were grommeted and not just affixed to the front, but wrapped around the paintings. So the discussion became, for many people were really into the straps. This discussion became how the straps felt like restraint, constraint, binding, bandaging, bondage around the painting body. Some people would say they embraced the painting body, but anyway, you can, talk about it in multiple ways. I like to point out that while all those tensions are there and they circulate around the paintings, and I still use straps occasionally because it's one of the visual devices in my toolbox, I guess, is they don't really constrain the painting body or restrain it, but they suggest possibilities of that, of restraining, of tying or untying, of connecting or not connecting. Actually, a lot of the straps are pieced if you look at them. Mm-hmm. They're fairly loose. And if you look closer, it's not the straps that hold the painting body together. It's the paint and the act of painting. Okay, that is really crucial to all I do. And that you bring forward now in time to the chenille paintings, and it still exists even though most of the chenilles don't have straps on a few. So that is still there, that kind of suturing, that idea of using paint, which the paint both acknowledges the violences done to bodies, and I use body, not figure, as social, political sites, at the same time that sutures, it heals, the paint is a poultice. It's just kind of what I do. Okay. So I think that all goes on in the chenille paintings. And it's exactly that tension of what seem like opposites almost that go on in the chenille paintings. But they're very much, like much of my work, very much about what's been buried, what's layered underneath, what's hidden, be it intentional or not, that has agency and asserts itself.
You know, I really appreciated the way you started to say, like, that there is such an incredible continuity of concern, both formally and intellectually, in the whole of your body of work. And so to focus just on these late works, I think it's late as in recent works, is instructive because it's almost like examining the cross-section of a tree and looking at the rings to try and like understand its growth in this like very this way that's like cutting through what was a very organic evolution. But in the Aldrich survey of 50 years of your work, it started with those works' presences. Those were the earliest pieces, I think, in the show, which were accumulations of painted textiles that were hanging on clothes hangers. And so the relationship to the body was very clear in what you were doing at that time. And then the next body of work had to do with the braided floor pieces. And then one could watch your work as you brought in all kinds of quote unquote non-traditional materials and different kinds of installation constructions. And what is striking about basically your work in this century, basically the past 15 or 20 years, is that all of that kind of formal experimentation with different structures for art or for paintings have really resolved themselves into canvases that go on the wall, stretch canvases that go on the wall with paint on them. So in a way, on one hand, it's a conservative move in which the work then becomes ever increasingly involved with a dialogue around the history of painting, particularly modernist painting. But it also is a move from three-dimensionality into the two-dimension, dealing really with the two-dimensional painting surface. And so I want to know, like, when did you feel like your vocabulary and your life in the studio had reached such a level that you said, I don't need to have this in the shape of a body in order for this to speak to the concerns of the body?
I don't think it's, I don't think there was a light bulb moment. It just, I'm trained as a painter. Okay, let me say this. I think all the work, starting with the presences up to what I do, even the stretched chenille paintings, for instance, they do occupy a space that is somewhat between painting and sculpture. Now, that's a big space in there between the two, as they're sort of traditionally thought of. And I think that's the space, that's the territory that I move around in. I'm very comfortable there. It's a third space, it's whatever you want it to be, but that's a place that I move around in. I'm trained as a painter, and I think that's important to know that even as you look at the more three-dimensional, i.e. more sculptural pieces, which most people would say are the pieces that stand away from the wall out in space, but of course that's another discussion. My approach, if you think about those hanging presences, the approach is huge, is a painterly approach to sculpture. It's additive, those hanging pieces of fabric. Think of them just like layers of brushstrokes. I think as a painter, I've always been interested in expanding painting to look at what are the assumptions about painting that I and most of us inherit. And I've been very interested in notions of expanded painting. So by the time we get to the floor pieces, I thought of those as paintings off the wall. Mm-hmm. With a reference to certain, cultural traditions and gendered traditions for sure. But they also were paintings on the floor, and there was supposed to be nothing on the wall. So the installation at the Aldrich was perfect. It was the only time I've really been able to show those works the way they were intended. Even the weave paintings later in the 70s, small paintings, at that point, I'm oil paint and Dorland's wax, and I'm incising into the weave paintings into the surface. And it's changing the surface. So the surface doesn't look like it's depicting or illustrating woven fabric. It looks like it's woven out of paint. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's protrusions again, almost like little burrs from an engraving or something. It's almost points. It's almost a little menacing again.
I just wanted to pick up on what you said about the almost menacing little points, because in the same way you were describing the works with the straps, I think in a number of pieces, and maybe this has to do with your interest in juxtaposition, but in a number of pieces, the experience of the painted surface or the act of painting as a reparative one, that prefigures a kind of violence. And I want to know, like in these works, in these more recent paintings in particular, how you see that and how you've thought about that in making your work, the relationship between the violence and the care.
I know it's there. I like that it's there. I don't know why I don't think about it more. I'm almost, I want to say even afraid to, because I don't want to over conceptualize something. I think sometimes it's better to work in that peripheral state that I was talking about. I guess I think that it's there because that's the way the world is. That's the way life is. I mean, in these very broad ways. I also live in the Southwest. You can trace it in terms of, crosses and religions in the Hispano culture and the cultures here in the Southwest. It's around me. And it's written on our bodies. Mm-hmm. And since things are written on our bodies, I, as you know, use the painting skin as the metaphor for the body. So it's there, but then there's this other part because, okay, here's where it kind of goes for me is like, okay, so I'm using the paint then in this reparative way as a poultice, as a suture, as a healing, as a joining material. But that in turn for me is then how I think about, it sounds really corny, but how I think about art making itself. Because I learned, or I understood early on when I was still, a young artist in Minneapolis in the late 60s. And I learned, because my life was very difficult at the time, that my art was, first of all, one place I could control. That's important in these pandemic times, okay? But I learned to trust the work. When I'm referring to the art, it doesn't matter what it is, it's the work. To trust the work, my work, that it would never take me someplace I couldn't handle. It always helped me understand, as I said, how I move through the world, or relationship to the world. So it's not just that the physical paint visually and physically functions to suture things together, but the very act of painting itself functions that way for me. And I think for others. I have to believe for others to go on and paint.
Well, at the same time, I love how you just described that. And then you have these objects that then move out into the world away from you. And they're shown in different contexts, and people meet them and they don't know who you are. And I wonder how you experience that radical shift of context in your own relationship to the work, and where people are suddenly experiencing them or describing them in ways that maybe move so far away from your own experience of them.
one thing I learned early on, and I can give you an example of this because it was so clear to me. I was installing a show, it must have been around 1979 or something, at the gallery, Lerner Heller Gallery, that used to be across from the Whitney Museum, and represented my work. And I was installing an exhibit of wrapped sculptures there. And as you know, when galleries are an installation, the galleries are basically closed to the public, but sometimes somebody wanders in and the gallery staff lets them, and they're just kind of there. Well, I just remember this woman coming in, and for one reason or another, everybody just let her wander around. Nobody was really paying attention to her. Nobody was courting her or really talking to her. But she spent time with the work, and that's crucial. She spent a lot of time with the work. And finally, I don't know how long she was there. It's a small gallery space. 20 minutes or so, I don't know. Finally, she, because of the activity that was going on, she began to realize I was the artist. And she started to talk to me, and she said, this is kind of a paraphrase. The gist of what she was saying is, you're probably going to think this is really stupid, but you know what these remind me of? It was kind of like that. And she talked about the paintings, what they reminded her of, the thoughts that came to her mind, the associations. And she got it exactly right. Without any art language, art rhetoric. It had nothing to do with the kind of more knowledgeable art, conversations I and many of our friends would have. So she didn't have that language, but she got it. She got it. And that is what is important to me. I don't care if they can't articulate it, but that they feel it, and I'd rather they feel it on their body than they get it in their heads. But it's nice when both happen, for sure. And so I've always taken that. I took that with me because, and as you know, I'm lucky enough to lecture about my art and, exhibit and stuff. And I'm always very interested in what people who aren't really art sophisticated, if they spend time with the work, that's a criteria. Where do they go? Where does the work take them? And so I believe my work can do that, is what it means. And I have to believe it can do that. I think especially if you work in an abstract and conceptual manner, you've got to believe that, because you don't have the crutch of illustrating, of representing, of spelling it out. You have to believe that, or you can't continue to do what you're doing. And you have to believe that perhaps it can affect somebody. I don't want to put down figurative or representational work, but you have to, because it can operate on multiple levels too, but you have to believe that conceptual work, that materials themselves, materially based abstract work, can affect people consciously and unconsciously.
I love that story, and that definitely is what I prioritize in my experience of work of art. And you kind of you spend time with it and let it open for you. And the way it does that is by following like exactly what's there. And I made diagrams of all of the paintings, and it's like, these grommets are on the top, these grommets go in, this grid looks like this. Okay, whatever. However, because I am not, because I know a lot of stuff about painting, and it's particularly the history of painting in the 20th century in New York, when I look at some of the work in this most recent show, for instance, like Fringe, I can't help but have one of those associations that come into my mind, like a Frank Stella. And the logic of a stela, those particular paintings that track in from the perimeter, the double grids. And so in your work, is it something that is interesting or not interesting for you, for someone to put them into that kind of conversation with abstract painting in New York since the 60s, et cetera?
It's totally of interest because it's there. I mean, you can't look at those paintings and not think of, you can't look at what I call the bandage quilts, of which Fringe is one of those paintings. You can't look at those paintings without thinking about the big white minimalists, the minimal paintings by white boys, basically, they're there. I mean, and I've grown up with that as part of my painting history as well. So the paintings, in a certain way, make a nod to that because, like I said, the work both participates in a discourse of modernist painting. At the same time, I like to think it interrupts it or subverts it, certainly messes with it on a certain level. And Fringe is a painting that very obviously does that. So the pieces in that painting, because again, different things really go on in different paintings. In Fringe, you have, as you said, it's actually burlap strips. In this case, that I just buy at a craft store. So, I mean, the whole reference to crafts and these traditions, I can go to a craft store and buy it. You can buy, people make burlap Christmas wreaths. You can buy burlap strips at a craft store. I buy burlap strips at craft stores. Okay. I take those strips, and some of them have hems, some of them have irregular edges. In Fringe, you have this fringy edge to them. That's on the strips. The strips are fringed. So already, this is a little different than what Frank would have done, right? Because he never would have had those messy, pointy fringes on the end, And of course, this is more three-dimensional, and he was working flat. But anyway, I've taken the strips, and intentionally, because that's what I was doing with the other bandage quilt paintings, where I was taking fabric and basically the strips and basically working from the outside edge or the perimeter and following it in almost in what would be a spiral, but a basic quilt pattern, very basic quilt pattern of concentric strips going into a center. So in this case, I'm using a fabric, a craft fabric purchased in a craft store that has points and edges and loose threads on it. And already, because of the process of layering those strips from the outside in towards a center, since I'm overlapping them, I'm already also doing something different than, even though it's a basic quilt pattern, I'm doing something different than the quilting as well. They're not laid flat next to each other. Each concentric strip overlaps the strips before it. So I get those frayed points sticking out. And what that does, and I haven't mentioned it, but it's true in the other paintings as well, the fact that there's overlap and those strips stick out means they're casting shadows. Light and shadow, intentional cast shadow, not only emphasizes the three-dimensional or relief elements on the surface elements on the paintings, but the idea of shadow itself is really, I should almost have it on the media listed. Oil paint, Dorland's wax, and shadow. Because the lighting in my studio, I'm making visual decisions in relationship to where shadow falls and how that visually relates to, what's peeking out from underneath that flap or that split in a seam. In this case, there's shadow cast because it's in what we might call low relief or something like that. And the quilt pattern goes in, but instead, as it gets into the center, the fabric doesn't quite cover the center. And there is this red slit sore at the heart of the painting. And so the fact that you got that red revealed from underneath this toothy burlap fabric strip already has so upset both the quilt, the flat quilt, but also, the minimalist painting of Frank Stella or others. And so it references all that, but it interrupts it, it subverts it. And in its reference to women's craft traditions, specifically quilting, gendered traditions like quilting, it reasserts the gendered history of quilting and quilt makers and so forth. And it kind of claims that. I think of it as kind of wresting back that abstract composition, taking it back from Stella or whomever else, and taking it back and saying, aha, quilters were doing this composition long before you came along. So it's got multiple references. They kind of conflate, but not entirely. And it's got that edge of violence in there. And yet that paint, as it sticks on those little fringed edges, actually protects those edges.
Mm-hmm.